I was still holding the folded obituary when my uncle laughed and said, "Go ahead, Haley. This is the part where you finally ask for what you think you're owed." Why did he sound so certain I'd make a scene? Why did my mom refuse to meet my eyes? And why was Mr. Keller suddenly placing a sealed envelope in front of me like it mattered more than the will we'd just heard? My name hadn't been in the main document at all. Not once. But this envelope, my grandfather's last instruction, had my name written across it in his handwriting. I didn't argue. I didn't react. I just opened it and started reading out loud. If you're watching this, tell me where you're from and what time it is for you right now. I'm curious who's here with me in this moment. And if you've ever been told to keep the peace while something felt completely wrong, you'll understand why I didn't raise my voice. I waited. A year before my grandfather died, I remember standing in my kitchen at 9:30 p.m., still in my work clothes, staring at my phone, while my Uncle Rick's name lit up the screen again. I already knew what he wanted before I answered. "Hey, kid," he said, his voice easy like we were calling to catch up. "Quick thing my partner pulled out last minute. I just need a short-term bridge. You're good for it, right?" It was never framed as a request. It was always framed as something already decided. How much I asked? 25, he said, like it was nothing. "I'll have it back to you in a couple months. You know I always take care of family." That last line used to work on me. It used to make me feel like saying no would mean I wasn't part of that family, so I wired the money. Not because I trusted him, not even because I believed I'd see it again, but because I had been trained quietly, consistently to be the one who didn't make things harder. That was my role. I was the stable one, the one with the degree, the one with the steady job as a senior financial analyst at a mid-sized firm downtown, the one who didn't need help. And somehow that translated into being the one everyone leaned on. A few weeks after that, my Aunt Elaine texted me, "Can you cover this just until I get my bonus? It's embarrassing to even ask." Attached was a screenshot of a credit card balance, $8,400. I stared at it for a long time. Not because I couldn't afford it. I could. That was the problem. I sent the payment the next morning. She replied with a heart emoji and a "You're a lifesaver." And then we didn't talk about it again. No repayment plan. No timeline. Just silence. The pattern didn't feel obvious at first. It never does when it's happening slowly. It was small things. Groceries here, a utility bill there, a temporary loan that stretched into months, then years. Each one had a reason. Each one came with just enough emotion to make saying no feel cruel, and my mom Diane was always there to reinforce it. "Haley, they're going through a lot right now. Your uncle helped us when you were younger. Family takes care of each other. That's just how it works." She never asked me directly to send money. She didn't have to. She created the atmosphere where refusing would make me the problem, so I kept saying yes. What I didn't realize at the time was that none of them were saying yes to me. Not in the ways that mattered. If I brought up a promotion, it was a quick, "That's nice, honey," before the conversation shifted back to Rick's business idea or Elaine's latest rough patch. If I mentioned feeling stretched thin, my mom would smile in that tight, careful way and say, "You'll be fine. You always are." It sounds harmless when you say it like that. But over time, it becomes a kind of erasure. You stop being a person in the family. You become a resource. The only person who didn't treat me that way was my grandfather. George Howard didn't say much, but when he did, it carried weight. One Sunday afternoon, I was helping him organize some old paperwork at his house. Bank statements, property records, investment summaries, things he insisted on keeping physical copies of, even though everything existed digitally. "You understand this stuff better than the rest of them," he said, tapping a stack of documents. "You actually look at the details." I smiled a little. "That's kind of my job." He didn't smile back. Looking, he said, and seeing are two different things. I paused, not sure what he meant. He leaned back in his chair, studying me for a moment longer than usual. Being responsible doesn't mean letting people use you, Hailey. There was no accusation in his voice, no anger, just a quiet kind of certainty. I nodded, but I didn't really absorb it. Not then, because at that point I still believed there was a line my family wouldn't cross. I just hadn't seen it yet. A few months later, I did. It started with something small, or at least it looked small. I was reviewing my own finances late one night, tracking expenses, adjusting projections, the usual routine I used to keep everything in order. That's when I noticed a familiar account number in a shared document folder my mom had once given me access to. It was one of my grandfather's accounts. I hadn't looked at it in a while. There hadn't been a reason to. But something about the balance felt off. So I logged in. The interface was the same. The layout hadn't changed, but the transaction history had. There, sitting in the middle of the page, was a transfer that didn't make sense. $180,000, processed in 3 installments over 2 weeks. Destination Howard Development Group. I didn't need to look that up. That was Rick's company. My first instinct was that there had to be an explanation, some kind of authorized investment, a structured loan, something formal, because $180,000 wasn't the kind of money that moved quietly. Not from my grandfather. He was meticulous, conservative. He questioned everything, even small expenses. I'd watched him argue over a $200 repair quote like it was a legal case. He wouldn't just hand over that kind of money without a paper trail. So where was it? I clicked into the transaction details. Minimal notes. No attached documentation. Just timestamps and confirmation codes. The dates lined up with a period when my grandfather had been in and out of the hospital. I felt something shift in my chest then. Not panic. Not yet. Something colder. I sat back in my chair and read through the entries again, slower this time. 3 transfers. Same destination. Same pattern. And no explanation. I reached for my phone, then stopped. Because suddenly I wasn't sure who I could call. I didn't call anyone that night. I sat there staring at the transaction history until the numbers started to blur, trying to convince myself there was a reasonable explanation I just hadn't found yet. There usually is one. That's what I tell clients all the time. Don't jump to conclusions before you understand the full picture. But this didn't feel like a misunderstanding. It felt like something had been hidden. The next morning, I went to the bank during my lunch break. I didn't mention my family. I kept it professional, detached, just another financial analyst asking questions about a legacy account structure. The woman across from me was polite but cautious. She pulled up the account, verified what I already knew, and then gave me the kind of answer that sounds helpful until you listen closely. "I'm sorry," she said, "but since you're not listed as a current authorized signer, there are limits to what I can disclose." "I understand," that I replied. "I'm not asking for access. I'm asking for clarification on the transaction classification." That made her pause. Because classification isn't about ownership, it's about how the system labels movement of funds. She clicked through a few screens, her expression tightening slightly. "These were processed as internal transfers," she said slowly, "but not between personal accounts." Then what I asked. She hesitated. "Corporate link disbursements." That confirmed part of it. The money had gone into Rick's company through a channel that made it look structured, almost legitimate on the surface. "Would there typically be supporting documentation?" I asked. "Yes," she said. "Usually a loan agreement, an investment memo, or authorization notes, and if there isn't..." She didn't answer right away. "Then it depends on who initiated the transfer," she said finally. "And under what authority?" That word stayed with me, authority. Because my grandfather wouldn't have approved something like that casually, not without a paper trail, not without control. I thanked her and left. Outside, the air felt sharper than it had an hour earlier. Or maybe I was just more aware of it. I walked a few blocks before pulling out my phone and calling Lena. She picked up on the second ring. "You sound like you're about to ask me something complicated," she said. "I need help reading something I said, and I need you to tell me if I'm overthinking it." "Those are usually the same thing," she replied. "Send it." I forwarded her screenshots of the transactions and waited. There was a long pause. Not the distracted kind, the kind where someone is actually processing. "Okay," she said finally. "First question, does your grandfather have any history of investing in Rick's company? Number, any formal business relationship number?" "Then this isn't clean." That was the first time someone said it out loud. I leaned against the side of a building watching people move past me like nothing had changed. "What kind of not clean?" I asked. "The kind where the structure is meant to look legitimate without actually being supported," she said. "Like routing personal funds through a corporate channel so it doesn't raise immediate flags." "Could he have authorized it?" "He could have," she said. "But if he did, there should be documentation, especially at that amount. $180,000 wasn't something that just existed in the margins." "Can you find out if there is documentation?" she asked. "I don't have full access," as I said. "That's the problem." "Not entirely," she said. "You have partial visibility, and sometimes that's enough." I knew what she meant. Follow the edges, not the center. That night, I logged back into every shared folder. I still had access to old family drives, archived emails, anything my mom had once forwarded without thinking it might matter later. Most of it was noise. Scanned receipts, old insurance forms, property tax statements, but buried inside a folder labeled estate planning, drafts. There was something different. A file list with timestamps, and one name that didn't belong. Amended will draft, GHV3. I clicked it. Access denied. Of course. But the system still showed metadata. Last modified 6 weeks before my grandfather died, editor Keller and Associates. That meant Mr. Keller had worked on it, which meant it was real. And if there was a version 3, there had been earlier versions too. I scrolled further. Another file. Amended will draft, not filed. That one was older. I tried to open it. Same result. Access denied. But this time there was a preview snippet. Not the full document, just a fragment the system had cached. Most of it was legal language, standard phrasing about asset distribution and executor responsibilities. But one line stood out, subject to final conditional clause pending family review. I read it twice, then a third time. Conditional clause. Pending family review. That wasn't standard. That meant something in the will wasn't meant to activate automatically. It required a specific condition to be met. Or not met. My pulse picked up, not fast, just steady and focused. Because suddenly the envelope from the reading the one Mr. Keller had handed me made more sense. It wasn't an afterthought. It was a trigger. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. If that clause existed, then the version of the will my family thought they understood might not be the one that actually mattered. I picked up my phone and texted Lena. "There's something else." Her reply came almost instantly. "Of course there is. What did you find?" I hesitated for a second, then typed it out. "A conditional clause tied to family behavior." There was a longer pause this time. Then, "That's not normal, Hailey." "I know." Another pause. Then, "That's leverage." I looked at the words on the screen. Leverage. Not revenge. Not justice. Leverage. And for the first time, I understood why my grandfather had looked at me the way he did that afternoon in his study. He hadn't been warning me about them. He'd been preparing me for this. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was panicking, but because my brain wouldn't let go of the pattern that was starting to form. A conditional clause tied to family behavior. Money moved without clear documentation. A will that had multiple versions, some of which weren't filed. And somehow I was supposed to be the one reading the final piece. By the next afternoon, I was sitting across from Mr. Keller in his office. The room looked exactly how you'd expect. Dark wood shelves, neatly arranged binders, a desk that had probably seen decades of conversations people didn't want to have. He greeted me with a polite nod, but I noticed something else too. He wasn't surprised to see me. "Hailey," he said, gesturing for me to sit. "I had a feeling you might come by." That told me more than anything he could have said directly. I sat down, placing my bag carefully on the floor beside me. "I have a few questions," I said. "I assumed you would. I didn't start with the will. I started with the money. There were transfers from my grandfather's account to Rick's company," I said. 3 installments, about $180 total. Mr. Keller didn't react right away. Not outwardly, but his fingers resting lightly on the desk pressed down just slightly harder. "That's not something I can discuss in detail," he said. "I'm not asking for details," I replied. "I'm asking if you were aware of them." A pause. Then carefully, "I was aware that your grandfather had concerns about certain financial decisions made near the end of his life." That wasn't an answer, but it wasn't a denial either. "Did he authorize those transfers?" I asked. Mr. Keller leaned back slightly in his chair. "That's a more complicated question than it sounds," he said. I held his gaze. "It shouldn't be." Another pause. This one longer. "Authorization," he said slowly, "can be formal or informal. Direct or influenced. That word landed exactly where it needed to. "You mean manipulated," I said. He didn't correct me. Instead, he folded his hands together. "Your grandfather was a very sharp man," he said. "But toward the end, he was also under pressure. Emotional pressure. Family dynamics can be complicated." I finished. Yes, I let that sit for a moment. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out a printed sheet, the metadata I'd found. I slid it across the desk. "Amended will draft. Version 3, I said. "Not filed." His eyes dropped to the paper. For the first time since I walked in, something shifted in his expression. Not panic. Recognition. "You've been doing your homework," he said quietly. "I've been paying attention," I replied. That faintest hint of a smile appeared, then disappeared just as quickly. "That would make him very proud," he said. I didn't respond to that. "Why wasn't it filed?" I asked. He exhaled slowly, as if deciding how much he could say without crossing a line. "Because your grandfather hadn't finalized it," he said. "He was still evaluating. Evaluating what people?" The word hung in the air between us, based on what I pressed. Mr. Keller tapped the paper lightly. "Behavior," he said. "Consistency. Integrity. And the conditional clause," I asked. This time, he didn't answer right away. He walked over to one of the shelves and pulled out a thin folder. He didn't open it. He just held it for a moment, then set it back in place. As I mentioned before, he said, returning to his chair, "There are certain provisions that can only be discussed under specific circumstances." "Like when the whole family is present," I said. He looked at me again, more directly this time. "Yes." So that part was real. "Why me?" I asked. It came out more quietly than I expected. Not defensive, not emotional, just honest. "Why did he want me to read it?" Mr. Keller studied me for a long moment. Because you're the only one he trusted to read it without reacting to it, he said. I let out a small breath. That's not an answer, I said. It is, he replied. Just not the one you were expecting. I leaned back slightly, crossing my arms. He thought I wouldn't fight back, I said. Mr. Keller shook his head. No, he said. He thought you would know when not to. That landed differently, because it wasn't about silence. It was about timing. I looked down at my hands, then back up at him. There's a line in the draft, I said, about a final conditional clause pending family review. He didn't confirm it, but he didn't deny it either. That clause, he said carefully, was designed to address exactly the kind of situation you're starting to see, which is, I asked. He met my eyes. A situation where actions taken before his passing might affect what happens after. There it was, not spelled out, not explicitly, but clear enough. If those actions cross a certain line, I said slowly, the will changes. Mr. Keller didn't speak. He didn't have to. I felt it settle into place then, not as a complete picture, but as something solid enough to stand on. This wasn't just about who got what. It was about whether they got to keep it at all. And the envelope, I said, the one at the reading. He nodded once. That's where the final language is contained, and you can't discuss it now. No, even if I already know part of it, especially then. That almost made me smile. Almost. I gathered my things, sliding the paper back into my bag. As I stood, he spoke again. Hailey. I paused. There's something else you should understand, he said. I turned back slightly. Your grandfather didn't put that clause in place to punish anyone. I waited. He put it in place. Mr. Keller continued to make sure the truth had somewhere to land. I nodded once. Then I walked out of his office, the weight of that sentence following me all the way to the elevator. Because for the first time, I wasn't thinking about what my family had done. I was thinking about what would happen when it was finally impossible for them to deny it. And more importantly, what I was going to do when that moment came. The reading of the will didn't happen in a formal office. It happened in my grandfather's living room. That was his request. Same leather couch, same coffee table with the faint ring from where he used to set his glass every night. The curtains were half drawn, letting in a dull gray light that made everything feel quieter than it should have been. Like the house already knew something we didn't. We were all there. My mom. Diane, sitting stiffly at the edge of the couch, hands folded too tightly in her lap. My Uncle Rick leaning back like he owned the room, one arm draped over the chair ankle resting on his knee. My Aunt Elaine beside him, posture straight, lips pressed into that polite, distant smile she used when she didn't want to show what she was thinking. Jason hovered near the doorway, not quite part of the conversation, but close enough to hear everything. And me, standing near the window at first, then eventually taking a seat when Mr. Keller asked us to. He placed a thin stack of documents on the table and adjusted his glasses. Thank you all for being here, he said. We'll begin with the formal reading of Mr. George Howard's last filed will and testament. Filed. That word mattered, because I already knew there were versions that hadn't been. He began reading. The language was exactly what you'd expect, structured, precise, almost detached. It outlined assets, accounts, properties, percentages. And then the names started. Primary ownership of Howard Development Group and associated business assets shall transfer to Richard Howard. Rick didn't move right away, but I saw it in his face, the subtle shift, the confirmation of something he had already expected. He gave a small nod like this was just a formality catching up to reality. Residential property located on West Elm Street shall transfer to Elaine Parker. Elaine exhaled softly, a quiet release of tension she probably didn't even realize she'd been holding. I sat still, waiting, not for my name, for something else. Because by that point, I already understood something my family didn't. This wasn't the whole story, Mr. Keller continued. There were smaller allocations, personal items, donations, structured distributions. My name never came up, not once. And eventually, he reached the end of the document. A pause settled over the room. Rick let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Well, he said, glancing in my direction, I guess that clears things up. Elaine gave him a quick look, subtle but enough to signal he should dial it back. My mom finally looked at me. Hailey, she said softly, please don't what I asked. I wasn't angry. That seemed to confuse her more than anything else. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, she said. There it was. Not concern, not empathy, containment. I nodded once like I understood, because in a way I did. Rick leaned forward, elbows on his knees now more engaged. You've done well for yourself, he said. No one's saying you didn't. But this? He gestured loosely toward the papers. This was always going to follow a different path. A different path. Like it had all been decided long before today. I looked at him for a second longer than necessary. Then I shifted my attention to Mr. Keller. He hadn't moved. He hadn't closed the folder. His hand was still resting lightly on the table just beside something I hadn't noticed before. A sealed envelope. Thicker than I expected. Cream-colored. My grandfather's handwriting across the front. Hailey. No last name. Just Hailey. Mr. Keller cleared his throat. There is one additional item, he said. The room changed. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But enough. Rick leaned back again, though this time it felt less relaxed. Elaine's smile disappeared completely. My mom's fingers tightened together again in her lap. Mr. Keller picked up the envelope, but didn't open it. This document, he said, was left with explicit instructions. He turned his gaze toward me. It is to be opened and read aloud by Hailey Howard in the presence of all immediate family members. Rick let out a short breath. Read aloud, he said. Why Mr. Keller didn't answer him. He handed the envelope to me. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Not physically, something else. Expectation, maybe. Or pressure. I ran my thumb along the edge of the seal but didn't open it right away, because I could feel all of them watching me, waiting, not just to hear what was inside, but to see how I would react. Rick shifted in his seat. Go ahead, he said, his tone light but edged with something sharper underneath. Let's hear it. Elaine didn't speak, but her eyes stayed fixed on the envelope like it might rewrite everything she had just heard. My mom looked at me again. Hailey, she said quietly, whatever it is, just remember this is still your family. I met her gaze. For a moment, I almost asked her something simple. Did you know? But I didn't, because I already had my answer. I looked down at the envelope again. My grandfather's handwriting wasn't rushed. It never was. Every letter was deliberate, clean, like he knew exactly what this moment would look like. I slid my finger under the flap and broke the seal. The sound was small, but in that room it might as well have been a door closing. I pulled out a single folded document, uncreased except for the one fold down the center. I unfolded it slowly, smoothing it out against my palm. There was a brief second where I just looked at the first line, not reading it, letting it settle. Then I lifted my head, and for the first time since I walked into that room, everyone was quiet. Completely. I took a breath, and I started reading. My final directive, I read, my voice steady, is not about who receives what, but about whether those distributions are valid at all. No one interrupted. Not even Rick. In the 12 months prior to my passing, I continued any transfer of funds, reallocation of assets, or financial decision made under undue influence, coercion, or misrepresentation shall be subject to independent review. I heard a shift, someone adjusting in their seat, small but sharp. The validity of this, will, I said, is contingent upon the absence of such actions. Rick let out a quiet breath through his nose, almost like a scoff. That's standard language, he said. Every estate has something like that. I didn't look at him, because it wasn't standard, and I think part of him knew that. I kept reading. In the event that evidence confirms material interference with my financial autonomy, all primary distributions outlined above shall be considered null and void. That landed. You could feel it move through the room, slow, heavy, undeniable. Elaine sat up straighter, my mom's hands unclasped slightly, like her body was trying to respond before her mind could. Rick didn't speak this time. He just watched me. Really watched me. I turned the page. In such a case, the entirety of my estate shall be transferred into a charitable trust administered under independent oversight. There it was. The part they hadn't expected. The part they hadn't prepared for. And I continued, the appointed supervisory authority for said trust shall be my granddaughter, Hailey Howard. No one moved. For a second, I wasn't even sure they had processed it. Then Rick leaned forward. "Hold on," he said. "That doesn't make sense." I lowered the paper just enough to meet his eyes. "It says what it says." "No," he said, shaking his head. "That's if something goes wrong. This isn't about us." I didn't answer, because I wasn't done. I lifted the page again. To ensure clarity, I read, I have already provided documentation of concern to legal counsel prior to this reading. Said documentation is to be considered part of the review process. That was the moment everything shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. Rick's expression changed, not to panic, not yet, but to calculation. Elaine's eyes flicked to Mr. Keller, then back to me. My mom looked between all of us like she was trying to find a version of this that didn't exist. "Documentation," Rick said. "What documentation?" I folded the paper carefully, not rushing it. "That's all that's written here," I said. "That's not all that matters," he shot back. Now there was tension in his voice. Not the casual confidence from earlier, something tighter, controlled. Mr. Keller finally spoke. As stated in the clause, he said, his tone, even a review process will determine whether the conditions outlined have been met, and who decides that, Rick asked. An independent auditor, Mr. Keller replied, based on the materials already submitted. Rick let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. "So we're just supposed to sit here and pretend like this is real," he said. "Like he didn't trust his own family." No one answered him, because the truth was already in the room. He just didn't want to say it out loud. I placed the document on the table in front of me. Flat. Visible. Untouchable. "This doesn't accuse anyone directly," I said. "It sets a condition." Rick looked at me sharply. "You think this is about me?" "I didn't say that. But you want it to be." That was the first time he said it like that. Like this was something I was pushing, something I was creating. I shook my head slightly. "This isn't about what I want," I said. "It's about what he put in place." Elaine finally spoke. "Hailey," she said carefully, "you have to understand how this sounds." "I do," I said. "Do you?" she pressed. "Because it sounds like you're suggesting that something inappropriate happened. And if that's the case, you should be very careful." There it was. Not denial. Warning. I met her gaze. "I am being careful," I said. Rick stood up, then pacing once across the room before turning back. "This is ridiculous," he said. "There's no way this holds up." "A clause like that based on what suspicion, not suspicion," Mr. Keller said. Rick stopped. "Then what evidence?" Mr. Keller replied. The words settled differently than I expected. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't emphasize it. But it carried weight, because it didn't leave room for interpretation. Rick looked between us, first at Mr. Keller, then at me. "You have something?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. Not because I was unsure, but because I was choosing the moment, the same way my grandfather had. "You said earlier," I said slowly, "that this was just standard language." Rick didn't respond. "You said it wasn't about you." Still nothing. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on my knees. "So if that's true," I said, "then the review shouldn't be a problem." That was the shift, the real one, because now for the first time he wasn't arguing the clause. He was thinking about the process, about what might come out of it. Elaine's posture changed, too subtle but there, less certain. My mom looked down at her hands. No one said anything for a few seconds. Then Rick exhaled sharply. "Fine," he said. "Run your review. Do whatever you think you need to do." He pointed lightly toward the document. "But don't pretend this isn't personal." I held his gaze. "It stopped being personal the moment the money moved," I said. That landed harder than I intended. Or maybe exactly as hard as it needed to. Because after that, no one spoke. Not right away. The room didn't explode. There wasn't shouting. Just a quiet, uncomfortable understanding that something had shifted and it wasn't shifting back. And as I sat there looking at the paper in front of me, I realized something else too. This wasn't the moment everything fell apart. It was the moment everything started being seen, clearly. And once that happens, there's no putting it back. No one left right away. That was the first thing I noticed. Usually after something uncomfortable, my family had a rhythm. People stood up. Someone made a joke. My mom would suggest coffee, and the moment would dissolve into something easier to manage. This time no one moved. Rick was still standing, but he wasn't pacing anymore. He had gone still in a different way, like he was recalculating. Elaine reached for her bag, then stopped halfway, her fingers tightening around the strap before she let it rest again on her lap. My mom sat exactly where she had been, her gaze fixed on the table like she was trying to find a version of this that didn't exist. Mr. Keller remained seated, hands folded, waiting. Not reacting. Waiting. I broke the silence. "I'm going to put something on the table," I said. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Rick looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Go ahead," he said. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thin folder. It wasn't thick. It didn't look dramatic. But everything inside it had been chosen carefully. I placed it on the coffee table between us and opened it. 3 transfers, I said, totaling $180,000. Rick didn't look at the documents. He looked at me. "That's not illegal," he said. "Families move money all the time." "I agree," I said. "They do." I slid the first page forward. "A family transfer usually has a structure." I continued. "A note. A memo. A loan agreement. Something that explains intent." Elaine leaned slightly forward now, just enough to see the top of the page. "These didn't," I said. Rick exhaled slowly. "That doesn't mean anything," he replied. He trusted me. I nodded once. "Then the documentation should reflect that." He didn't answer. I moved to the second page. "Here's the timing," I said. "The transfers were made over 2 weeks. During that same period, he was admitted to the hospital twice." My mom's head lifted slightly. Rick's jaw tightened. "That's not relevant," he said. "It is," I replied. Because it changes how consent is evaluated. That word consent shifted the air again. Elaine's voice came in softer but sharper. Hailey, you're interpreting this in the worst possible way. I'm interpreting it based on patterns I said. I slid the third page forward. Here's where the funds went after they hit Howard Development Group. Rick's eyes dropped for the first time. Just a glance. But it was enough. You split the amount across 3 internal accounts, I said. Then 2 of those accounts transferred out again within 48 hours. That's called operating capital, he said quickly. Not when there's no corresponding revenue entry, I replied. Silence. Not the confused kind. The recognizing kind. Elaine sat back. My mom looked at Rick. Really looked at him. When were you going to tell me about this? She asked quietly. Rick didn't respond to her. He kept his focus on me. You've been digging into this behind our backs, he said. I've been looking at information that already existed, I said. There's a difference. You had no right. I didn't need permission to see what was already there. That landed harder than I expected. Because it wasn't about access. It was about control. Rick took a step closer to the table. You think this proves something, he said. It doesn't. I didn't say it proves everything, I replied. I said it's part of a pattern. Elaine crossed her arms. And what exactly is the pattern you're suggesting, she asked. I didn't rush my answer. Money leaving without structure, I said. Timing that aligns with vulnerability. And documentation that doesn't match the scale of the transactions. Rick let out a short laugh again, but this time it sounded thinner. You're building a story, he said. I'm building a timeline, I replied. There was a difference, and he knew it. Mr. Keller finally leaned forward slightly. Mr. Howard, he said, addressing Rick directly, the presence or absence of intent will be evaluated through the audit process. Rick turned toward him. So that's it, he said. You're just going to let this play out like we're on trial. No, Mr. Keller said calmly. I'm going to let the facts speak. That phrase settled into the room with a kind of finality, because facts don't negotiate. They don't adjust themselves to make things easier. Rick looked back at me. You sent this to him already, he said. It wasn't a question. I met his gaze. Yes. Elaine's head had turned toward Mr. Keller. You had this before today, she asked. He didn't hesitate. Yes. For how long? Long enough, he said. That was all he gave. But it was enough. Because now the timeline wasn't just mine. It was official. My mom leaned back slightly, her hand coming up to her mouth. I didn't know, she said softly. No one answered her. Not because we didn't hear her, because we didn't know what to do with that. Rick stepped back from the table. For the first time since this started, he looked off balance. Not defeated, not yet, but no longer certain. This is going to blow back on you, he said to me. You realize that, right? Maybe I said. He frowned. That doesn't bother you. I thought about that for a second. Not the situation. The question. No, I said. What bothers me is pretending I didn't see it. That was the closest I had come to saying something personal, and it was enough. Because after that, no one tried to argue the numbers. They didn't question the transactions again. They didn't dismiss the timeline. They shifted, subtly, from denying what had happened to thinking about what would happen next. Mr. Keller closed his folder. The independent audit has already been initiated, he said. You'll each be contacted for documentation requests. Rick ran a hand through his hair. Elaine looked away. My mom said nothing, and I sat there looking at the papers in front of me, realizing something I hadn't expected to feel, Not satisfaction, not relief. Clarity, clean and quiet. Because for the first time, everything that had been implied was now visible. And once something is visible, it can't be managed the same way anymore. As we started to stand, as chairs shifted, and the room slowly began to move again, I caught a glance between Rick and Elaine. Quick, sharp, and gone just as fast. But it said enough. This wasn't over. Not for them. And not for me. Because the audit hadn't even started asking its questions yet. The first call from the audit team came 3 days later. It wasn't dramatic. No accusations, no confrontation. Just a calm, measured voice asking if I was available to walk through the materials I had submitted. I was. By then, everything had already been organized, timelines, transaction logs, supporting notes. Not because I expected it to escalate this far, but because that's how I work. If something doesn't make sense, you don't just look at it. You structure it until it does. The auditor assigned to the case, Daniel Brooks, was exactly what you'd expect. Precise, neutral, focused on process, not emotion. "We're not here to assign blame," he said during our first call. "We're here to determine whether the conditions outlined in the will have been met. Conditions, not suspicions, not feelings." That distinction mattered. Over the next 2 weeks, the process unfolded quietly. They requested additional records from the bank, internal documents from Howard Development Group, communication logs, authorization trails, everything that could establish not just what happened, but how and why. Rick didn't call me during that time. Neither did Elaine. My mom did. Twice. The first time, she kept it general. "They're asking a lot of questions," she said. "It feels excessive." "They're following the clause," I replied. "I know," but she hesitated, searching for something that didn't sound like she was taking sides. "This is still family, Hailey." I let that sit for a second. "I didn't start the process," I said. "I just didn't stop it." She didn't have a response to that. The second call was different. Shorter. Quieter. "They asked about the timing," she said. "Of the transfers," I asked. "Yes." I waited. "They wanted to know who was present when your grandfather signed off on them," and another pause. I told them what I remembered. That wasn't an answer, but it told me enough. Because memory in situations like this becomes its own kind of evidence. By the end of the 3rd week, the audit report was finalized. Mr. Keller asked all of us to come in again. Same room, same arrangement. But nothing about it felt the same. Rick didn't lean back this time. Elaine didn't wear that controlled smile. My mom sat with her hands folded again, but this time they weren't tight. They were still. Waiting. Mr. Keller didn't start with conversation. He opened the report. "The independent review has concluded," he said. "No build-up, no softening, just facts. The findings confirm that multiple transfers from Mr. Howard's personal accounts were executed without sufficient supporting documentation and under circumstances that raise concern regarding informed consent." Rick exhaled sharply. "That's not the same as wrongdoing," he said. Mr. Keller didn't look at him. He continued. "The review also identified subsequent movement of those funds through corporate accounts in a manner inconsistent with standard business operations." Elaine shifted beside him. "That's interpretation," she said. "It's pattern analysis," Mr. Keller replied. "Another distinction." And again it mattered. He turned a page. "Based on these findings, the conditions outlined in the final clause have been met." That was the moment. Not loud, not explosive, but definitive. Rick didn't speak. Elaine didn't interrupt. My mom closed her eyes briefly, because we all understood what that meant. "The primary distributions outlined in the original will are therefore rendered void," Mr. Keller said. No one moved. The estate will be transferred into the designated charitable trust as specified. Rick let out a breath that sounded more like disbelief than anger. That's it, he said. That's the decision. That is the outcome defined by the clause, Mr. Keller replied. Rick stood up, pacing once across the room again. This is insane, he said. You're taking everything based on a technicality. I looked at him. It's not a technicality, I said. It's a condition. He turned toward me. You're really going to stand there and act like this is fair? I didn't answer right away. Because fairness wasn't the point. This isn't about what I think is fair, I said. It's about what he put in place. Elaine's voice came in quieter now. There has to be some kind of resolution, she said. Some middle ground. There is, Mr. Keller said. We all looked at him. If funds are returned and cooperation is demonstrated, he continued, there may be a basis for partial reconsideration within the trust structure. Rick stopped pacing. You mean we give the money back, he said, and hope for leniency. I mean, the process allows for remediation, Mr. Keller said. Not negotiation. Another line drawn. Clear. Firm. Rick looked at Elaine. Elaine looked back at him. That same glance I had seen before, but longer this time. Heavier. Because now it wasn't about what they could argue. It was about what they had to decide. My mom spoke again, barely above a whisper. How much, she asked. Mr. Keller didn't look at the report this time. Based on the audit, he said the amount in question exceeds $300,000. That number landed differently than the first one, because it wasn't just the original transfers anymore. It was everything that followed. Rick ran a hand over his face. Elaine looked down, and for the first time since this started, no one tried to deny it. They shifted again, from defense to consequence. Then Rick looked at me. Not angry, not defensive, just direct. You can stop this, he said. I held his gaze. No, I said. You're overseeing the trust, he replied. You have influence. I have responsibility, I said. Not control. That's the same thing he said. It's not. He stared at me for a second longer. Then he nodded once. Not in agreement. In recognition. Because he understood something then that he hadn't before. This wasn't a fight I was trying to win. It was a process I wasn't going to interrupt. And that made it something he couldn't manipulate. The room fell quiet again. Not tense. Not chaotic. Just settled. Because the outcome wasn't uncertain anymore. It had already been decided. All that was left was what each of us chose to do with it. Rick asked to meet 2 days later. Not at the house. Not at Mr. Keller's office. A neutral place, a quiet restaurant just outside downtown, the kind of place where conversations stay low and no one pays attention to the table in the corner. I almost didn't go. Not because I was afraid of what he would say, because I already knew, but I went anyway. When I walked in, he was already there, sitting with his back straight, hands clasped in front of him like he was trying to hold something in place. Elaine was beside him. My mom wasn't. That told me more than anything else. Thanks for coming, Rick said. I sat down across from them. You said it was important, I replied. He nodded once. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then he leaned forward slightly. We've been talking, he said. I asked. Elaine and I. I glanced at her. She gave a small, controlled nod. We're willing to fix this, Rick continued. Return what needs to be returned. Cooperate with the audit. Whatever it takes. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't hear him, because I was waiting for the rest. And I asked. He hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then we need you to step in. There it was. Not a request. A condition. You're overseeing the trust he said. You have a voice in how this plays out. If you support us, if you advocate for partial release or adjusted terms, we can stabilize this before it gets worse." Elaine added carefully, "It doesn't have to end the way it's heading." I leaned back slightly, studying them both. Not their words, their tone. Rick wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't dismissive. He was controlled, measured, trying to reframe the situation into something negotiable. Elaine looked different too, less certain, more aware of the consequences. But neither of them said the one thing that would have mattered. I let the silence stretch just long enough. "Do you understand why this is happening?" I asked. Rick frowned slightly. "Because of that clause," he said. "No," I said. "That's not why." He looked at me, waiting. "It's happening," I continued, "because money moved in a way it shouldn't have, because documentation didn't exist where it needed to, because decisions were made when he wasn't in a position to fully protect himself." Elaine's gaze dropped briefly. Rick held mine. "We didn't take advantage of him," he said. "I didn't challenge him directly. I didn't need to." "The audit already answered that," I said. He exhaled slowly. "This isn't black and white," he replied. "You know that." "I do," I said. "But this part is—" That was the difference he couldn't work around, because nuance doesn't undo a pattern, and intention doesn't erase a timeline. Elaine spoke again, softer this time. "We're not asking you to ignore what happened," she said. "We're asking you to help us move forward from it." I looked at her, and for the first time I heard something real in her voice. Not manipulation, not control, concern. But even that didn't change the structure of the situation. "What does moving forward look like to you?" I asked. Rick answered this time. "It looks like you using your position to make sure we're not wiped out completely," he said. "To make sure the trust doesn't take everything." And in return I asked. He paused. "Then we make it right." I let out a small breath. Not frustration. Recognition. Because that was the same pattern, just with higher stakes. "You don't get to make it right after you know the outcome," I said. "That's not accountability. That's damage control." Rick's jaw tightened. "That's not fair." "No," I said. "It's accurate." The word landed clean. No emotion attached. Just fact. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. For a moment he didn't speak. Then he looked at me again. "You could stop this from going all the way," he said. There it was again. Not a question. An assumption. That I would step in, that I would soften it, that I would do what I had always done. Absorb the pressure. Stabilize the situation. Make it easier for everyone else. I felt something settle inside me then. Not anger, not even resistance, just clarity. "I'm not taking anything from you," I said. Rick frowned. "That's not what this is about," he replied. "I know," I said. "That's why I'm saying it." I held his gaze. "I'm not taking anything from you," I repeated. "I'm just not protecting you anymore." The table went quiet. Elaine looked down at her hands. Rick didn't move. For a second I thought he might argue, push back, try one more angle. But he didn't, because there wasn't one left. After everything that had been laid out, the transfers, the timelines, the clause, the audit, there wasn't a version of this where I stepped in and made it disappear. And I think at some level he finally understood that. He nodded once, slowly. Not agreement. Acceptance. "Then I guess we handle it," he said. "Yes," I replied. "You do." We sat there for a few more seconds. No resolution. No reconciliation. Just a clear line where something had shifted permanently. Then I stood up. Elaine looked at me like she wanted to say something else, but she didn't. Rick stayed seated, watching, not with anger, not even with resentment, just awareness. And as I walked out of that restaurant, I realized something that hadn't been clear before. This wasn't the moment I lost my family. It was the moment I stopped carrying them. A few months later, things looked quieter from the outside, cleaner, like everything had settled into place. The trust had been established exactly as my grandfather outlined. An independent board oversaw the allocations, with strict guidelines on how funds could be distributed, primarily toward community housing programs and small business grants. My role wasn't what Rick had assumed. I didn't control the money. I didn't decide who got what. I reviewed compliance. I signed off on oversight reports. I made sure the structure he put in place stayed intact. Nothing more, nothing less. Rick and Elaine followed through at least partially. They liquidated assets, repaid a significant portion of the funds flagged in the audit, cooperated with documentation requests without pushing back the way they had at the beginning. It didn't reverse the outcome, but it changed the tone of it. Less resistance, more containment. We didn't speak much, not because there was an argument still happening, because there wasn't anything left to argue. My mom called occasionally, short conversations, careful ones. She never brought up the trust directly, never asked me to reconsider anything. But sometimes in the pauses between sentences, I could hear what she wasn't saying. The version of our family she had tried to hold together was gone, and there wasn't a way to rebuild it the same way. I didn't try to fix that. Not because I didn't care, because I understood something I hadn't before. You can't rebuild something on the same foundation that broke it. One afternoon, I stopped by my grandfather's house. It hadn't been sold yet. The trust was still deciding what to do with the property. The air inside was still, familiar, but lighter somehow, like the tension that used to sit in the corners had finally been cleared out. I walked into his study without thinking. The same desk, the same chair, the same drawer where he used to keep everything he didn't want anyone else touching. I opened it. Not because I expected to find something, just habit. Inside there was a single envelope, not sealed. My name written on it again. Hailey. I sat down before opening it, not rushing, not bracing, just present. The letter inside was short. His handwriting was steady like it always was, Hailey. If you're reading this, it means you saw what others chose not to. I didn't leave you less. I left you different. Money can be replaced. Control can be negotiated. But clarity, once you have it, doesn't go away. You won't need what they think matters. You'll need the freedom to decide what does. That's what I'm giving you. Grandpa, I read it twice. Then I folded it back along the same crease and held it in my hands for a moment longer. There was no grand realization, no emotional break, just a quiet understanding that settled in slowly and stayed. He hadn't been trying to make me win. He had been making sure I didn't lose myself trying to keep everything else together. I placed the letter back in the envelope and stood up. As I walked out of the house, I didn't look back. Not because it didn't matter, because it finally did in a different way, something I could carry without being pulled backward by it. The rest of my life didn't change overnight. I still went to work, still ran my numbers, still made decisions based on logic, not emotion. But one thing was different. When my phone lit up with a name I recognized, I didn't feel obligated to answer. And when I did answer, I didn't feel responsible for fixing what wasn't mine. That was the shift. Not dramatic, not loud, but permanent. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like enough. There's a difference between revenge and boundaries, and I didn't fully understand that until everything played out the way it did. I never needed to take anything from them to feel whole again. I just needed to stop protecting decisions that were never mine to carry. If you've ever been the one expected to keep the peace at your own expense, you know how quiet that pressure can be and how heavy it becomes over time. Letting go of that role doesn't make you selfish. It makes you honest about what you can and can't control. Forgiveness, if it comes, doesn't have to mean access. It doesn't have to mean going back to the way things were. Sometimes it just means you're no longer holding on to the version of people who hurt you. I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to choose between family expectations and your own boundaries? And if stories like this resonate with you, consider subscribing. There's more to explore together. This is a fictional story created for entertainment, education, and reflection.